What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Traditional Press. I am your host, Jonathan James Roberts here, and ready to rock and roll with some pros and cons of monarchy. We are going to go over the list of every single pro and con. I've done a whole series on pros and cons, so if you want to check out those other videos, check out my channel and you'll be able to see the rest of them. There are quite a few different pros and cons that we're going to be talking about here because this whole pros and cons thing is quite a large subject and there is a lot to go over, but we're going to keep it brief today. We're going to mainly do a list format, so jump on in and let's do this thing. Okay, first one on our list here, we're going to start with the pros. Pros of monarchy are that it reduces partisanship and creates a sense of unity. This is a fabulous thing. Monarchical systems of government eliminate the need for political parties focusing on different ideologies. Instead, the monarch with their cabinet looks after the state as a unity. Even though there are separate departments focusing on different issues, there is a marked lack of competition between the departments, which discourages polarization immediately. Additionally, the monarch acts as a symbol of unity for the people when they are looking for common ground to relate to. Now, we're going to talk about the cons of monarchy. So we're going to do one and one and one and one here. So cons of monarchy I have up here. Lack of democratic accountability. Monarchs are not held accountable to people via the ballot box once they are considered to have failed in being an effective leader. Main issue here with this con is that it presupposes that democratic accountability is a good thing. In my opinion, it is absolutely not. A 5-minute conversation with the average voter will make you pretty much give up on democracy. All right, moving back over to the pros list here. Monarchies have a faster decision-making process. Unlike a parliamentary system, which requires a vote from the majority for a law to be passed and then has to be signed in by the legislative heads, the decision-making process in a monarchy comes to an end with the opinion of the ruler, and this allows the government to act immediately at times of need. Whereas, we've got a con here which is very similar to our first con, you're going to notice, but it's actually slightly different. But it still makes our list of pros and cons. And this here is there is a lack of democratic legitimacy. And this con says that the people do not vote for their monarchs, which means that they do not represent the will of the people. They are instead beings of their own will and power, specifically speaking about the kings or queens. Again, here with this con, the difficulty is going to be will of the people. Is the will of the people only grantable to an elected official? Or does the will of the people go with the sovereign? Which is a very difficult question to answer. I've talked a lot more about that in other videos, but we're going to skip right on by and keep moving here. Pros and cons. The third pro that we're going to talk about here is that it increases government savings. A monarchical system of government eliminates the need for elections, which utilizes a major part of government funds. The amount of money saved can be used by the government to improve the standard of living of its citizens, and this has been proved over and over and over and over and over and over and over again. Everywhere in the world that you want to look, the monarchical systems spend less on their government and they provide more services for their people. We're going to jump back on over here to another con, which is that there is an excessive amount of power invested in a single person. And the con here states that the monarchs are the supreme judicator, legislator, and executor. And though they are assisted by their advisors, it will still be them who have the final say in things. This is unlike politicians who share their power with others and who have to worry about the way electors perceive them. This is an absolutely fascinating con that people talk about monarchy. Typically, what they mean is that power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. But if you look at the current state of politics in the world today, just pick any country and really just start digging into the scandals and tell me just about how much those elected officials are avoiding scandal by being elected. And then get back to me. I'd love to hear about that. Then we're going to bunch back on over here to pros. Next pro of monarchy is that monarchs have a smooth transition of power. In a monarchy, the next ruler is already chosen and known by the citizens, which avoids riots, protests of citizens after the ruler has been announced, and this is quite useful in the case of abdication by the current ruler or in the case of the sudden death of the ruler, as the next monarch will take over immediately. And this whole issue with, kings taking months and months and months and months to get coronated and all that kind of stuff is kind of silly, because reality shows that the king immediately steps into power after Queen Elizabeth, for example, has passed on. Well, we already have a King Charles. Even though he hasn't technically been coronated, everybody understands that that's just a ceremony. Everybody has known for a very long time that King Charles was going to be king, and that is extremely helpful to avoid things like, the January 6th general discomfort in this particular country. So we're going to move on to disadvantages here. The cons here is that it is more difficult to change the leadership internally. Once a monarch becomes effectively ill, so the con states, or is an effective or poor leader, it will be difficult for others around him to oust him out of his position and get him replaced with a leader who is more effective. As elected oligarchy, the politicians do not share the same problem, since they are subjected to elections, and those who are ineffective can be prevented by the other politicians from acquiring excessive power. This is perhaps the greatest con which is talked about when people are engaging in a subject of monarchy. Typically, they have this idea in their mind that rulers should be able to be changed out like old dirty dish rags, and when everyone starts to stink, you just sort of cycle them out a little bit. But the problem with that is that you create a system of short-term thinking where politicians understand, I've only got 4 years, so I'm going to do whatever I can in those 4 years. And so you create a system of disruption after disruption after disruption, and you create chaos. Whereas when you have a king who knows he's going to rule for the next 40, 50, 70 years, Queen Elizabeth, that king or queen is more likely to take a slow and steady approach and to adopt long-term thinking, because they know they don't have to get it done right now. They've got the next 5 years to work on this thing, and it's gonna be okay. And that creates a very different flow in terms of government and thought processes for how things are supposed to be done. So back over to the pros here. We have number 5, which is trained leaders. In the past, there was no guarantee that the heir to the throne would be someone who could handle all the responsibilities that come with it, but in the modern age, crown princes are trained from a young age and are well educated on political matters, at times much more than the people's elected representative. The media's scrutiny on monarchs also prevents the future leader from engaging in futile and unpleasant affairs. Thus, a trained ruler will take over when it is time. There is nothing better than a person who has been raised for a role since childhood. They know the game and they are good at it, and that means that they're going to be effective. Politicians are typically not raised to be politicians from birth. Usually they come from varied and diverse backgrounds, and they generally make a mess of things. Now we're getting on to the next one, and this one's a little bit more exciting to talk about here when we're talking about pros and cons of monarchy, and that is number 5 on our cons list. And this con states that monarchy may lead to tyranny. For a monarch with absolute power, it will be quite easy to be blinded by the authority they wield. Misuse of authority for the oppression of the poorer sections of society due to a tyrannical ruler would inevitably give rise to riots, leaving many suffering and the nation in ruins. If the monarch is oppressive, violent, or corrupt, there is little that can be done to solve this unless the monarch gives up, dies, or just generally abdicates, or, as happens a lot of times in history, the monarch is kind of kicked out by their family. This one is, like I said, is pretty exciting to talk about. What do you do when the monarch goes into full tyranny mode? And the question that I have to ask then is, what do you do when your republic goes into full tyranny mode? Adolf Hitler. Basically the same problems that have to do with republics going into tyrannies and monarchs going into tyrannies are gonna be generally the same, although monarchs generally have a little bit of an advantage in this area because of the lack of democratic legitimacy. And what that means is once the monarch starts going crazy, generally the monarch understands that it's their head on the pike when the rioters come a-calling, and if the military jumps on board, that's it for them, which means that monarchs throughout history generally act a lot better than senators, council members, consulate presidents, prime ministers, or whatever it is that you're going to talk about, or Roman consuls, or whatever it is that you're going to talk about. Generally speaking, the kings act less tyrannical. Okay, moving on back over to pros. Number 6 on our pros list is that monarchies provide a stable and balanced government. And what that means is that the government is not varied based on political ideology, because there is only one political ideology within the particular country. As I said previously, there are no political factions tearing apart the country, meaning that the monarchy has an ability to last longer, to take care of more of its people equally. Never is there going to be a situation in a monarchy where only 50% of the country's populations are possible to be taken care of, as happens in countries like the United States, where if you have a liberal president in charge, it is impossible for the liberal president to take care of half of the country. And if you have a conservative president in is the highest leader in the country, 50% of the country is going to be disenfranchised. This never happens in a monarchy. Moving back on to disadvantages here, we have number 6 on our list, which is that there is a lack of diversity in the government. This concept says for the government to work according to the needs of the citizens, it is necessary that there are people within the government conveying the needs of a particular class of the society to those in power. Diversity in representatives in the government means diversity in the laws formed, and that the laws formed will be for the good of all different communities. However, in a monarchy, the opinion of one person is law. This is a very interesting con, and it depends on your worldview. If you believe that diversity is the primary method by which you achieve morality, you're going to be in a difficult position here, because the republics are necessarily anti-diverse. And that is a funny thing to say, because it seems that republics and democracies are going to better cater to people of diverse backgrounds, but the reality is whoever is in charge is only going to set up and take care of and promulgate laws for their one particular set of constituency that they get their support from. If you are a member of the Whig Party, you are only going to write laws for the Whigs. If you are the member of the Conservative Party, you are only going to write laws for the Conservatives. And what happens is a hodgepodge mess where nobody is taking care of the way that they are supposed to, and where the government is constantly attempting to take away something from one group and give it to another. And what happens here is a fundamentally unfair system, whereas a monarchy is much more fluid, because the monarch has the ability to take care of all of the needs of all of the people all at once. Additionally, under a monarchy, You're going to have a traditional approach, meaning that the needs of the people aren't going to be as varied all of the time. But we're not going to talk about that in depth, although I do have plenty of videos on that particular subject. Moving back up to the pros of monarchy. Number 7, government is a local matter. Monarchies are so much more than a king and his crown in a palace somewhere far away. A traditional monarchy comes with small, local lords who have sworn fealty to the king and who have real relationships with their people. They must live in their own small cities, and they must go out among their people. In a traditional monarchy, we're not talking about absolute or constitutional monarchies here. We are talking about traditional monarchies. If you want to know the difference between these, I also have videos on that subject, so dig a little and you'll learn a lot. In a traditional monarchy, you can actually talk to the government, amazingly enough. The local lord and his kids grew up in the same schools, going to the same parks for holiday, going to the same grocery stores as you and your kids. Government is supposed to be a person and not an idea. Moving on, back to the cons of monarchy, that monarchies change according to the ruler. A good ruler would lead to a well-managed nation, while a poor leader could destroy all that his ancestors had worked so hard for. Whether the predecessors of a highly efficient ruler would continue the legacy or not, we can never be too sure. Also, there are cases where a ruler is crowned at a very young age due to the sudden death of their predecessor. For nations with absolute monarchy, this can lead to instability in government. Or, as in the case of Frederick II, the Holy Roman Emperor who led the Sixth Crusade, which, by the way, was the only bloodless crusade, so take a note there, you can have a situation where a king is perfectly capable of, more than perfectly capable of ruling their own country, but also capable of engaging in peace talks and treaties with parties that have been at war for literally hundreds of years. So it's kind of a toss-up whether or not this issue is going to be more real or less real. So, unfortunately, the whole idea of a government changing according to the ruler today seems almost laughable, since every few years the government radically changes for us in our democracies. So this particular con is not really as much of a con as you would think it is, unless, and if we are going to say that it's a con, then it's 10 times more a con for countries that are constantly cycling out their leaders. Now let's go back up to the pros. In monarchies, the monarch is usually revered by the people under their power. God save the king, or so it goes. A monarchy has always been viewed by the common people as an almost holy institution. It's only ever the elites in a country that despise the king. And if you look up the ratings for kings, even in the modern world, you will see that the monarchs of the world today significantly outperform their counterparts in political approval ratings. People love the king. It's incredible to know that there's this stable force in government that will last forever and that you'll never have to worry about. Politics is a dreary, dismal, dreadful affair anyways, and engaging in it on the regular and having your hopes and dreams crushed every time you go to the ballot box is a pretty miserable experience, and it is frankly a lot more calming of an effect to have a monarchy than it is to have an election every 2 days. Moving back on to disadvantages here, we have number 8, which is that the monarch has unparalleled power. There is little to nothing that the people can do, as this con says, to oppose the monarch in an absolute monarchy rule. Though constitutional monarchy allows representation of people in the government, the amount of power vested in the monarch is still quite high and can be used by the monarch as per their wishes. We have here another problem, because this con basically presupposes a lack of traditional monarchy, and I'm opposed to both constitutional and absolute monarchy. But when we're talking about absolute, incredible, unparalleled power, let me just drop you a couple hints. The FBI, the NSA, the CIA, the IRS. Then we'll have a conversation about unparalleled power. Moving back up to the pros for monarchy here. Under a monarchy, we have nonpartisan leadership. This is a pretty important point. You notice that it has trickled into 3 of our other points here. It's very important to talk about this one. Monarchs are born to rule, and they're not answerable to anyone except God. On the other hand, politicians need to win the elections, and they need to play to a very specific ideological crowd in order to get the needed votes that can be a disadvantage to those who have opposing views. Also, politicians, and this is key, politicians will need the support of wealthy benefactors in order to get elected, and those wealthy benefactors are hoping to get rewards once the politician wins. You are basically guaranteeing that your system is going to be corrupt by having elections. It's a terrible plan. Moving back on to cons of monarchy here. Number 9 on our list of cons is that there is no checks or balances on a monarchy. This con believes that the rulers report to no one, thus they only rule based on what they want rather than on what the people want. That may be true under an absolute monarchy, but it is absolutely not true under a traditional monarchy. Under a traditional monarchy, the checks and balances are the 3 kingly laws. The 3 kingly laws are submission to a higher power, meaning that if you get excommunicated by the church, you're in trouble. Number 2, hereditary succession. You don't get to pick who's going to be the next king, so be nice to your kids. Number 3 is hereditary succession. Number 3 is family participation in government, which is otherwise known as checks and balances. And this means that the power of the monarch is going to be balanced out by the power of the local lords. Remember, if you do not have local lords, you do not have true monarchy. Local lords are extremely important. There is no government which is smaller and more local than a traditional monarchy. Moving back up to our pros list here, we have leadership focus, which is number 10 on our list. Since they need not worry about losing in the election, in whatever election is coming next, and their popularity is not as big of a concern, monarchs can focus more on running the country while thinking in long-term focus, and not in short-term focus as what elected politicians do. Long-term goals can actually be met. A monarch rules for life, and once they set a long-term plan, they pursue it to the end. Unlike in traditional politicians' routes, where long-term plans are scrapped off once the term for the political leader is over, which is why today we see so many executive orders happening from the office of the president, because politicians realize they can't get anything done. If President Trump, for example, had been able to remain in office for 40 or 50 years, the wall on the Mexican border certainly would have been completed. If President Obama had been able to remain in office for the next 40 or 50 years, it would be an absolute fact that Americans would have universal health care right now. But because these politicians are not able to remain in office for a long term, it is not possible for them to be able to accomplish big things. It's impossible to build a Great Wall of China with a democratically elected government, but it is possible to build a grand and incredible structure like that with a monarchy. President Trump failed, but the kings of China did not, and there's a reason for that. Moving back on to our cons here, we have number 10, which states that competency of leadership is not guaranteed. Monarchs hold power via hereditary succession, and it is difficult to know whether the monarch who succeeds the previous ruler is even capable of leading the nation. What if they're mentally handicapped? What if they get epileptic seizures? What if they're having different kinds of struggles and they're not able to be mentally focused? What if they get addicted addicted to drugs. What happens when you have these situations? And the question that I ask in response is, what happens when you have a totally incapable leader as your president? What are you going to do? You're just going to suffer, and then you're going to try and get another leader elected. But what if your incompetent leader is also tyrannical and they seize power? You can end up in a world of hurt. And this is where the family of the monarchy tends to swoop in and take over and help incompetent leaders. Additionally, it's possible to have leadership deposed if they have mental illnesses. This has happened in history, and typically the families of the monarchs take care of this all on their own because they recognize that their power directly stems from having an efficient leader. It's not a world that we have ever lived in where mad kings are allowed to run around forever and ever and ever, but we do see mad tyrants run around forever and ever and ever, and that creates a whole nightmarish situation. So traditional monarchies do not breed tyrannical rulers. Absolute monarchies, yeah, we can run into real problems there. And there's a reason why in every single case of absolute monarchy, there was a revolution in that country throughout all of history within about 100 years. Sometimes they went as long as 150 years if they had a very traditional mindset. But absolute monarchies absolutely create a lot of mess. Traditional monarchies don't, because if you have an inefficient leader, the local lords step it up and they help to rule the country while the king is infirmed. This is very normal. This has happened a ton in history and also happens in cases like, frankly, Sleepy Joe, who is not really at the helm of anything. The country is being run by somebody else probably 80% of the time when he's struggling over there. Unfortunately, he's not doing so hot mentally, but he's making it work. And generally speaking, if Sleepy Joe can make it work, then you can imagine the same situation would happen in a monarchy. Moving on to back to our pros here. Number 11 on our pros lists. Monarchies are advocates for strong defense. Monarchies have consolidative powers which advocate for strong defensive posture, resulting in fortified borders and more internal security to their people. This is generally speaking true throughout history, that defense is a greater focus for monarchies than offense. And the reason for this is the local lordship issue, because the local lords need to maintain their own fortifications, they need to maintain their own batteries, they need to maintain their own armed forces, something like a National Guard. If the National Guard was actually locally run by the individual states like it's supposed to be, you would see a pretty similar situation. So the more that the states are in charge, the happier, the more local the government. The more the federal government is in charge, the less it really matters whether or not you have any states. And in a traditional and local monarchy, the states would essentially be represented by local lords who have their responsibility to guard their localities, and so mustering an enormous force is significantly harder, which is why during the traditional monarchical era, you see battles taking place with significantly smaller amounts of men. Why? Because it's harder to get enormous offenses to go and smash somebody, but it's very easy to maintain your own world, to maintain your own towns, to maintain your own people, and that's what traditional and local monarchies do. Moving back on to disadvantages here, we have number 11, which says that monarchies promote wealth inequality. In monarchies, the ruler and his ministers can amass a lot of wealth while the public remains poor, since they can't get into higher positions offered by the ruling class. And this con is absolutely fascinating to me because this objection fails to consider the economy as the vehicle for mobility and instead believes that the government is the key to wealth. Additionally, we see that in the modern world today, about 15 people hold like all of the world's wealth. The amount of wealth that can be generated in a democratically elected system by such persons as Jeff Bezos, for example, is extraordinary and impossible almost to even comprehend how someone could have so much money. So the issue of wealth inequality, I believe, is worse in a democratically elected country than it is in a monarchically led country. Additionally, in a monarchical system, there is no incentive for creepy demagogues to claw and scrabble their way into power, and there is no incentive for business leaders to become corrupt and pay off politicians because they won't get anything from it. And the monarchy won't benefit from creepy and disgusting politicians or corporate CEOs. There is simply no benefit. The monarchy benefits when the economy as a whole benefits, not when some rich CEOs benefit. Moving back up to pros for monarchy here. Monarchies, and this is a really big one right here, monarchies have reduced corruption. The rulers in monarchies are the government, and they benefit a lot from their position. And in return, everyone is identified with the ruler in the ruler's creation of a mutually beneficial relationship. The monarchical relationship is a symbiotic relationship. The people relate to the monarch relates back to the people. Everywhere you look, even in the modern world, with our broken and sad versions of monarchies that we have left today, there is significantly less corruption. Look up the corruption perception index of monarchies versus their neighbors. You will be astounded. Typically, there is 20% less corruption in monarchies, and the reason for that is obvious. There's no reason to pay anybody. There's no reason for bribes because you can't get anything out of a bribe. You basically just have to compete like everybody else. Back on to our cons of monarchies here. Number 12, monarchies do not have much upward mobility. In monarchies, the common man will always remain common, and it is impossible to rise into the nobility in any other way than the lottery of your birth. And this objection is fascinating because, again, people typically believe that the government is the path to success, which is not a true ideal. However, for those that desire power, monarchy is opposed to the very idea of demagogues. And for those that prefer constitutional monarchies, this objection is irrelevant entirely, as positions in government are still unobtainable. But for traditional or even absolute monarchies, we have to actually talk about this, because when we're thinking about the economic engines of a particular locality, monarchies have superior engines of economic growth than do democracies. It's not possible to have fully functional socialized healthcare in most democratically run countries because the politicians get so greedy so fast that they just gobble everything up. But in most of the monarchies of the world, their socialized healthcare systems are working. And that's amazing because by all logic and math, socialized healthcare should never work. But it does somehow in these monarchical countries, and it's pretty astounding. And some other countries have pulled it off, but these are very unique places. But we're not going to get into too much of that. And the free market generally works better than socialistic tendencies, but even in these socialist monarchies, they're still making money, which is astonishing. But the real issue here is the desire for power, because when you have individuals, demagogues, who really just want to get a piece of the action, those are people I would be wary of. People that want to claw and grab at power are not the sort of people that I trust. I don't know if you trust that kind of people, but I certainly don't. I don't particularly think that that's a great plan. People who have a lust for power are just not very trustworthy, whereas most kings are pretty humble and down to earth because they know they didn't do anything of themselves to deserve this position. And I know that that one may ruffle a few feathers, but it's true. Moving back up to our pros here for monarchy, and monarchies have transparent chains of command. Everyone knows who's going to be the successor of the active ruler since the chain of command is simplified. Additionally, as the head of all governmental branches, the king heads a chain which is crystal clear. And even if a king doesn't feel confident in a position of direct generalship, which often happens, everyone knows who and what and where is exactly taking place in the chain of command. You never have a situation where the Secretary of State is undermining the president, for example, because they're of two different political parties. No, always in the military, they act on behalf of the king. It's always His Majesty's Navy, His Majesty's fighter jet, His Majesty's petrol can, as it were. And you would be, if you served, a colonel in His Majesty's army. Everyone understands what and who and how and why they are serving, and this really works in a monarchy. Moving back over to our cons. Number 13 on our list, our unlucky 13, the ruler of a monarchy may not be a serious person. The successors to a monarchy always know that they will rule the nation for decades and may not take their responsibility seriously, and this may affect the economy of the nation. And in order to examine this particular objection to monarchy, you have to start thinking about politicians. And if you get just as many unserious people in politics who are just there to make a buck, just there to make their constituency happy, just there to ensure themselves a great retirement package, or just there to golf, or whatever it is that they're doing, you're going to run into just the same problem. So if any democratically elected country is going into default, probably this con is not as serious as people are making it out to be. Additionally, we are going to have on our cons list here, or on our pros list here, number 14 for monarchies, that monarchies act in the interest of everyone. Once again, you're starting to see a pattern here, I hope, if you've been with me this whole time, that monarchies move forward as one loyal nation, and this ensures that decisions are made for the best interest of everyone. You will see that monarchies are far, far, far more unified than any other form of government ever imagined by human beings. Moving on to number 14 for our cons. This is the list here, that absolute power has too much potential for tyranny. And this objection states that with a monarchy, you can thrive if the king or queen wants you to, but a businessman only has the freedom to operate within a monarchy if the ruler allows them to. And if the ruler wants to stop them, you're out of business. And in contrast to much of our feelings, absolute monarchies around the world today still maintain some of the best corruption perception index scores anywhere. So this objection, even with absolute monarchies, even with constitutional monarchies, which again are not the real and ideal form of monarchy, they still have less corruption than their democratic neighbors. So the reality is, you're going to have to pay off the city, you're going to have to pay off politicians in order to succeed in a democratic form of government as a businessman far more than you will have to under a monarchy. And the proof is in the pudding in this one. Monarchies have way less regulation than democracies. It's just a fact, unfortunately. Okay, number 15. For pros here says that the blame in a monarchy is not shared. Monarchs are not sharing the blame with or passing it on to others once they make a bad decision, in the same way that politicians do, because the government ultimately leads to one culprit, while politicians spread the blame amongst hundreds. Think about all of the different things that politicians manage to get away with all of the time. Why? Because, well, it's somebody else's fault that this didn't get done. It's somebody else's fault that we didn't build the wall because, oh, those dad-blasted Democrats stopped us. Or it's somebody else's fault why Obamacare disappeared because, well, that dad-blasted Trump eliminated Obamacare. Somebody else is always at fault whenever things don't go right, whenever you fail to fulfill a campaign promise. Whenever you're caught embezzling money, some other person is going to catch the blame, or some war in a foreign land is going to take the media coverage and heat away from yourself. Okay, number 15 on our cons list here says that monarchy creates a class system within society. And this objection states that class structures in monarchies are solidified with different social classes. There is no upward communication for individual levels. And the reality is, this one is only an objection in a world without hierarchies. If you believe in a hierarchical world, this objection simply disappears. If you believe that there will always be a leader and there will always be a follower, then this objection is really not relevant anymore. This objection has really only ever been relevant to those individuals with a lust for power. Only those individuals are dissatisfied with the ability to simply conduct business and go about one's day without enormous and upsetting and tyrannical government influence on our lives. Everyone is pretty much satisfied with that, except for those individuals that want to be politicians. And those individuals go about preaching that class structure is indicative of tyranny, when it is in fact they who are more likely to institute class structure than the monarchies. So this really is an issue of hierarchies. And if you have a problem with hierarchies, it's because you have a problem with authority. Moving up to our pros here. There is a single form of government, or a single form of contact for foreign governments. And in monarchies, there's just one point of contact, and that's either going to be the monarch or the ruling group. And this becomes especially important, as I mentioned earlier, when such persons as, for example, Hillary Clinton sat down continually with foreign leaders after her government had been ousted in the election to Donald Trump. And Clinton was making very different deals with, unfortunately, very, 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 very corrupt nations such as Ukraine, while Trump's government was saying the opposite. And a lot of the deals that Hillary Clinton's government made with Ukraine have led to the Ukrainian war, unfortunately. So we have a situation where our government is not on the same page. Russia's getting a very different message every few years. What is America going to do? Nobody knows, because when we get this president, they're going to do this thing. When we get this president, they're going to do this thing. Nobody has any idea whatever's going to happen, and that's because government is always different. And we're going to move back up here to our pros. We just did a pro. Actually, we're going to bounce back down to our cons here. I want to stay on track here. Under a monarchy here, the potential for absolutism is too great. Even if you have a traditional monarchy, so they say, the potential to move into an absolutist regime is too great. Absolute power corrupts absolutely, and if all the powers of the state are collected in one man, eventually that man will become a tyrant. I say that I do not like absolute monarchy, and I think the proof here is found in history for why absolute monarchies don't work. But if you manage to maintain all three of your kingly laws, you absolutely will not have an absolute monarchy. As soon as any one of these three laws is broken, the rest are sure to follow, and an absolute monarchy is sure to follow that, and a democratic revolution is sure to follow that, and tyranny always follows democratic revolution. So let's stick with the traditional monarchy. Moving back up to our pros here. Number 17, this one is near and dear to my heart. Family is the model for society under a monarchy. Monarchs are considered as the nation's father, and his children are his subjects. Monarchy is one organic kind of human organization that everyone can easily relate to. And family is the most important unit of society. Under a monarchy, family is the nucleus of society. Under a democratic form of government, the individual voter is the primary unit of society, and you can see for yourself which one of these two forms of government is going to be more stable. Back down here to our cons for monarchy. Our number 17 here, the con to monarchy is stated that government is too human. And the objection here is that governments ought to be more of a process than a person. People are too fickle and need to be bound to the rule of law, which is higher than they are. And here we see that there is a fundamental misunderstanding about laws, because under our three kingly laws, submission to a higher power is always number one. If you ever have a king that does not submit to a higher power, who is, for example, a secularist who only believes that himself is the highest rule of law, the highest authority, you're going to break the three kingly laws, and you are going to run into serious problems. But Government can't be a process. Government has to be a human. Why? Because there's always a human in government. As soon as you want to tell me that you're going to have an artificial intelligence program run the nation, then we can talk about whether or not you're serious about having government be a process and not a human. Moving back up to our pros, we are on number 18, if I can find it here. Number 18. Tradition, and this is our last pro for monarchy, by the way. Traditional monarchies typically last for hundreds of years. This is the culmination of everything that we've talked about on our pros list. Monarchies are more stable, they're more prosperous, they grant more freedom, have more homogeny, they have lower crime, they're bastions of tradition. Monarchies have life tenure, they're not subject to random elections where anything can happen at any time. And this and unlike the politicians, which cause economic and political turmoil all the time, monarchies, in contrast, remain beacons of stability throughout all of the nation's ups and downs. And as the nation rises, the monarch rises. As the nation falls, the monarch falls with it. Typically in history, monarchies are going to outlast every other form of government in terms of longevity, and that's just because they're more stable and more comfortable to live in. The last con here on our list is a fun one. This is actually Niccolo Machiavelli's point that monarchies are easy to conquer but hard to hold. And this one is sort of a both and sort of, because if a monarchy is hard to hold, that's a pro. If they're easy to conquer, that's a con. And this is where the local lordship of a monarchy is going to come into full bloom and full fruit and full flower, because even if you can manage to knock down the king's armies, capture him even, you still have to contend with all of the local lords. The situation that would be easy to understand in the modern world today would be if you managed to defeat the official army of the United States, you would still have to fight off all of the reservists in the Army National Guard in each individual state. And if the individual states, such as Texas, for example, wanted to mount a really serious National Guard, they could have an army which is as big as most of the armies that are fielded around the world today by themselves. So it would be extraordinarily difficult to defeat the state of Texas in battle. And the same thing happens with local lords. When you have local lords which are serious, have real munitions, real planes, tanks, guns, bombs, the whole 9 yards, they're going to be much more difficult to defeat. And this plays out in history. A lot of times an aggressive attacking force will smash into a nation, take out the king, and think that they've won everything, and then they spend the next 50 years trying to defeat the local lords, and eventually the local lords kick out the aggressive tyrant after he's old and dead, and they reestablish their monarchy, and they were resilient, and they maintained their national identity, even though there was this incredibly intense attack upon them. So there you have it. That's our list of pros and cons. We've got 18 and 18 pros and cons. If you want more information on those pros and cons, check out my other videos, because I go into depth into each one of these particular points. Not a one of them is left hanging. So if you're interested, definitely check out the rest of my vids on my channel. Thank you all so much for popping onto the traditional press here. This has been the pros and cons list of monarchy. It's been a blast. Absolutely appreciate you being on here. If you enjoyed this video, and if you're still with me, I hope I've earned a subscribe. Please ding that little bell for notifications for when I come out with the next video, which I come out with one every single Monday so far. That's my schedule. Hopefully I'll be able to keep to that, even though work's picking back up for me now here. Loved having you guys on here. Stay strong out there, and I'll catch you all next time. This has been the Traditional Press Podcast. Thank you for listening, and tune in next time for more traditional ideas and exploration of the why behind the what.